Thank you for joining us with your devices muted. We ask that you keep your devices muted so that everyone can enjoy the conversation as we go along this evening. I'll remind you that the chat feature is available for your questions and ask that you not use it for dialogue so that we can focus on the questions that we have for Dr. Costa and so that I can keep up with those questions and he can answer as many as possible. The box is dynamic, meaning it's always moving. So if there's dialogue back and forth, it'll be more difficult for me to answer those questions. This event will be recorded and it will be posted on the South Orange Maplewood School District website. So if you, a friend, a neighbor have missed any part of it, you may go to the website to view the event very shortly. I will begin by introducing Dr. Gerry Costa, who is the founding director of the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health at Montclair State University in New Jersey. He was also founding director and led the YSC Institute for Infant and Preschool Mental Health from 2000 to 2011. He is a professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the College of Education and Human Services and is a member of the faculty of the Infant and Early Childhood Development PH.D. program at Fielding University, formerly the ICDL Graduate School. He serves as a trustee and president of the Interdisciplinary Council on Development and Learning, founded by Drs. Stanley Greenspan and Serena Wider, and served as a consultant to 0 to 3 for the past 20 years. He is one of the first 16 expert faculty selected by 0 to 3 in the new DC 0 to 5 classification system. He sits on several state and nonprofit boards and was appointed by 2 New Jersey governors to serve on the New Jersey Council for Young Children, where he headed the Infancy and Early Childhood Mental Health Committee. He received his PhD in developmental psychology from Temple University. He was one of the first 16 recipients of the DIR certificate by Dr. Stanley Greenspan and Dr. Serena Wider, and is a trained faculty member in the Brazelton Touchpoints model. He holds a self-reg certificate from the Merit Center in Canada, led by Dr. Stuart Shanker, and the CAE-CMH is the first licensed self-reg center in the United States. He holds an endorsement as an infant mental health clinical mentor through the New Jersey Association for Infant Mental Health and Michigan Association for Infant Mental Health. He led a 4-year infant and early childhood mental health systems development project in partnership with Child Health Development Services of Wyoming and the Wyoming Developmental Disabilities Division, and is the principal author of a 15-module infant and early childhood mental health training curriculum. He led a 2-year-long training and consultation project with 25 mental health mentors with South Dakota Voices for Children, and he led a strategic planning initiative with the Missouri Association for Infant Mental Health Early Childhood. Since 2018, he has served as the coordinator of the Northeast Regional Terrorism and Disaster Coalition under the leadership of Drs. Joy and Howard Osofsky as part of the Terrorism and Disaster Coalition for Child and Family Resilience, a center in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network at Louisiana State University. He served as the first principal investigator of the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence from 2012 to 2018, and in January 2020, he became the principal investigator of the New Jersey Inclusive Education Technical Assistance Project, an $8 million, 5.5-year project advancing full inclusion in New Jersey public schools. He is past president and an emeritus member of the New Jersey Association for Infant Mental Health. He has presented keynotes, workshops, and trainings at hundreds of events and programs. Dr. Costa has been honored with numerous awards, including the Christian Kielsen Champion for Children Award by the New Jersey Child Care Advisory Council, the Lucille Weistuck Early Childhood Special Education Award by the New Jersey Division for Early Childhood, and the Golden Bell Leadership Award by the New Jersey Mental Health Association. He is a New Jersey licensed psychologist, has a consulting and training practice, and is the author of articles and book chapters on autism and infant mental health. He has presented on these topics in 27 states and 11 countries. And Dr. Costa is here for us this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Costa, for joining us in partnership with the Parenting Center, the Department of Early Childhood Education, and the Department of Special Education. We welcome you. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Ms. Samuels. And I felt embarrassed. That was probably more than people needed to hear. And of course, we took so much time from the presentation, but I am so honored to be with you tonight. And I know that this has been such a difficult time in our world and in our lives. And so I think talking about how stress has affected us, certainly as the teachers and parents, but also how it affects our children. So I'm going to go through the presentation. And again, I look forward to your comments and questions. I know that Ms. Samuels will be monitoring them in the chat area. And again, thanks to all who have made this possible, especially Karen Weiland, who first invited me to be with you. So I want to be sure. There we go. Thanks. My key wasn't responsive at first. So I won't really spend all that much time talking about our Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health. But in fact, we have been such a strong part of the formative programs in South Orange Maplewood, and we are thrilled to be here. I am thrilled to be here as part of this. This is a bit of a description of what we mean by infant and early childhood mental health. And suffice it to say that what we think about in this space is the origins of well-being, how children develop their emotional and social lives, and their ability to experience and express all the range of human emotions and connect intimately with each other. So the presentation tonight will be based on that. So what I'd like to do, and again, I know we have a limited time, but I'm going to try to, race through some of this, not too quickly, but to really try to get to the end of our presentation, which really is about, so how can we help ourselves and help young children when stress takes over. So I'm going to make just a brief comment about what is happening in our world right now. I think this is unprecedented. I think that for all of us who've been around for some time, and even those who are younger, this is probably the most unusual and stress-filled time in our lives. So I want to talk to you about that. I also then want to welcome you as parents, especially, and I'm going to give you a warning about parenting. And I say this both as a developmental and clinical psychologist, an infant mental health specialist, but also as a dad, and to tell you about parenting and share some things that I think I hope you will resonate with. We'll talk about brain development, as that's really what is happening during this critical early period of time. And even the fact that when we talk about our brain, it sounds like it's one organ, but it actually is multiple organs. And so I'm going to talk about three major brains that we have within our brain. I'm going to talk about this inherent basic need that we all have to feel safe and how that happens. And that when stress does occur and it jeopardizes our sense of safety, I want to talk to you about the good, the bad, and the ugly when that happens. Because as you know, stress is part of everyday life, and stress, in fact, can be part of our growth as well. So I want to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of stress. Then I'm going to talk about, towards the end of the presentation, something called the self-reg framework. It's a wonderful way of thinking about the hidden effects of stress, and I'll talk about the 5 domains of stress that are described in the self-reg framework, self-regulation framework, and then even steps on how we can then help children when stress is overwhelming for them. And finally, how our connecting with each other is critical for stress. So first, the world. I think we're facing multiple pandemics. I think the first one that we became aware of this year was coronavirus and COVID-19 as it spread throughout the world and has hit the United States, so that we are approaching nearly 200,000 deaths related in some way to COVID-19. But also what we've become aware of this year is, again, the centuries-old lingering consequences of systemic racism and disparity. Our world has been organized around principles that clearly have treated people without the same set of rules, and has created an inequity. Certainly there are so many things to speak of about that. But even with regard to COVID revealed so many of those underlying systemic differences and inequities that occur in healthcare and in illness. So we know that's certainly part of the background of stress, and at this point, there's more stress than we can handle at times. And so how do we help the children at that? So what happens when stress happens in our lives? Well, one thing we know is that as the world has changed, we do feel perhaps more stress than ever. The future feels unknown and unpredictable. And by the way, one of the identifying characteristics of uncertainty in the future is stress, that we are worried about what will happen. We feel a loss of control and a sense of not knowing exactly if we will be safe, if we will be okay in the future. And again, that sense of safe. But each of us is different. Each of us has a very unique history, and sometimes your own history, who you were as you grew in your family of origin and in your community and culture. Many of us have had histories and lives that have hurt us or have been led to a kind of woundedness. One of my favorite ways of thinking about this is that many of those who were wounded actually, as Ernest Hemingway said, become strongest in their wounded places, in their broken places, and that the wounded helper and the wounded healer is really part of our effort to be sure that we can help all those who have been wounded. But because of that woundedness, each of us will not react in the same way to stress. Each of you as parents will not react to the things that your children do sometimes that can press those buttons in you, that can, kind of, as we often say, some of you may remember the old movie Jaws, and there was a certain kind of staccato music that would come whenever the shark was about to appear, and something like dun 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 dun, and that shark music would stir us up. Many times in our own work as parents, we feel that shark music happening. Something is stirring up in us, and sometimes our very children, whom we love, can stir that up in us. So it's, in some sense, it's important to know that. And many times, by the way, we will react to people based on all the things that have happened to us and imagine and experience feelings and reactions based on that. But sometimes we're aware of them, but in many ways we are not aware of them. So one of the things we'll talk about later on is how helpful it is for you to be able to be sure and take care of yourself. That the best thing your child can do when they are stressed is for you to be able to co-regulate them, for you to be able to lend your calm as they begin to get excited and yell, for you to be able to lower your voice and connect. All those things are hard, which has led me to really want to share with you. Again, sometimes I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. There we go. So I want to warn you about something about being a parent. And for those of you who are parents, I have 2 adult children. And, I always say to folks, whenever my kids were very young, especially when they were teenagers, if you were to look through my window and saw the way I talked to my kids and yelled at them, you would say, I will never listen to this guy ever about parenting. So I'm a sinner when it comes to this work, but I have loved my life as a parent. I regard it as the most important thing I've done, but it's humbling. So the first thing to know is being a parent is the most humbling experience. Just when you think you know things in life and your career is maybe going well, or you're doing well in your job, or you're feeling a sense of success, sometimes just being a parent means that you don't have any idea what you're doing, that you're figuring this out. You're flying the plane as you're building it. And so I want to just acknowledge that it's humbling. It's filled with trial and error. But the good news is, in our work, we've learned this and established this empirically. And in fact, you need not be perfect. You just need to be good enough. And good enough is a very important concept in our field. Actually, a famed author and infant mental health specialist and child psychologist, an analyst, and pediatrician, Donald Winnicott, would say that we just need to be good enough parents. So as a parent, by the way, you probably have, through the course of your lives, attended workshops like this or presentations. And there's a part of us that imagines for us to be a good parent, we really just have to learn a lot and know things. People used to have this fantasy that I, as a psychologist, probably had such an easy time as a parent because I kind of, had all this training and knowledge. And so I'm Italian, so I can say this. Forget about it. It just isn't the way it goes. We are taught most and formed most as parents by the kind of parenting we had. And while learning and knowledge can really help, we have to pay attention to how we became who we are. So check in with yourself before you address your child. Get a sense of what's stirring up in you. And by the way, never underestimate the power of an apology to your child, no matter how young. Sometimes we lose our temper, or we do something that we're, not so happy about, and we sort of look back at it. But the biggest thing is 90% of being a parent is just being there. But I don't just mean being there passively, being with your child in an emotional connection. And that, you see, will be the biggest part of how we help children when they are stressed. So I'm going to show you this little clip, and I hope this works, Keith. But this is a clip that may surprise you because it's about dogs and cats, but I'm going to suggest to you that it's a clip about being a parent. So let's hope it works.
It's okay. I'm going to show you. See? See? We'll show her again. We'll show her. That's so funny. You almost got it. Easy.
So I think, I'm sorry. I think there are many who probably would accuse me now of being anti-cat, and I don't mean that all to be the message you got there. But the message was that there was something about the parent, the dog and the pup, that suggested a quality of being a parent that really was about not wanting to force the outcome, which was to get down the stairs, but to be sure that the child knows he can do it, that there was something about the scaffolding, the support. And again, had we had a chance to talk back and forth, and I would love to hear your reactions to it. I would expect that what we would talk about together is how what allowed the puppy to come down was the constant support of his mother, and that what allowed the mother to constantly support the puppy were the people around her, behind her, cheering her on, and the baby. And so that sense of interpersonal support really says it all. I'm going to pause for a second. Hey, Keith, did that come across adequately? Well,
It definitely did, Dr. Costa.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks. I just wanted to be sure that, without seeing all of your faces and hearing you, it's kind of so hard to do this. I'm imagining that you're out there, and I know you are. So thanks. Thanks. I think that was you, Miss Samuels. I appreciate it. So I'm going to introduce a concept to you related to what we just saw. And that is that, and this is an evolutionary concept. Forgive me. It's one of these words that we don't say every day in our lives, but I think it is a very important concept if you walk away with this idea about infants and young children. The infants and young children of many other species, including dogs, by the way, but not as much dogs, but other larger mammals, a horse, cattle, their young can really become independent and mobile very quickly soon after birth. But human infants are what's called altricial. Human infants require, after birth, an extended period of support in order for them to become fully able to function as a human. And so altricial species like humans can't do things on their own. They can't move around. They can't root for food or search. And so what happens is they need to be nursed and reared and nourished for a much longer period of time. And so we sometimes refer to this as a kind of second womb, where infants and young children, for the first year to 2 to 3 years of life, and even longer, require that they be consistently nurtured and supported. And they require, therefore, this second womb, except this womb is not a physical womb, but it's a psychological, social, interpersonal, emotional womb for an extended period of time. Now, why is this important? It's because for years we didn't know this. And for years we imagined infants could be picked up and held by anyone. We imagined that infants could be moved from house to house and caregiver to caregiver with no undue harm to them. And then when we began to see that infants were behaving badly or were having a lot of behavioral and emotional and social difficulties when they've been through these multiple separations, we imagined that somehow the infant was biologically bad, that something had been damaged. We now know otherwise. This critical connection between caring and relating and nurturing and emotional reciprocity that we're going to talk about in a second is the most critical piece of human development. So we humans, it turns out, have this biological and evolutionary imperative to have connectedness like this. Now, this has implications, by the way, for lots of practices that we have in child protective services, in early care and education settings, certainly in parenting and family life. But for now, all I can say to you is think about secondary altriciality, this idea that babies are helpless, and it is because of that secondary womb that they become fully human. And so we'll touch on that shortly. So my daughter is an occupational therapist, and she's, she and I have talked over the years, and she's actually seen some of my work and has been to work with me over the years when she was younger. And in one presentation, as I often do, I make this statement that if I had a bumper sticker, it would say in the beginning there was the relationship. And so about 4 years ago, I received this in the mail. She's an occupational therapist in Florida, and she sent this to me, which I thought was great. So I'm showing it to you, that this, in fact, would be my bumper sticker, and I actually have it, but that's not on my car. I should have kept it safe. But in the beginning, there was the relationship. And so relationship is really what it's about. So let's talk about stress and what happens in stress. Well, the first thing to know is stress in many ways is inevitable. And we often talk about a gradation, a range of stress. And the three kinds of stress we often talk about is kind of typical stress, moderate stress, and toxic stress. And these representations represent those. So typical sort of everyday manageable stress occurs. So meeting new people, starting the first day of school, all the kinds of things we might imagine that would be tolerable stress or manageable stress. Then, by the way, there are some stressors that are more difficult, like this could be hurricane, a disaster. In many ways, depending on your experience beforehand, COVID might be regarded as a tolerable stressor in your family. Losing someone in your family, a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, losing a parent, depending on the circumstances in your life, as hard as that is to imagine for a child, might be a tolerable stress, something that's tragic and unavoidable, but that if there's people around who buffer the effect of that loss and continue to nurture and help the child and be attuned to that child and nourish them, children can do well. It's the toxic stress, the chronic, continuous stress of having abuse, neglect, parental mental health illnesses, addiction, severe poverty, very significant changes that activate in your body a stress response that we're going to unpack in a short while together, because that really is the stress that we need to talk about. All three of these levels, everyday kind of tolerable stress, modest stress, moderate, more tolerable stress with support, and then toxic stress. All of these require our thoughtfulness, but to be aware that not everyone, every child that encounters a stressor will respond in the same way. So you may be surprised at what I'm about to do, but I'm going to give it a shot, and I've done it many times, so I hope you enjoy it. All of you know, I think, what the Jack-in-the-Box is. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't know who it was that ever imagined a Jack-in-the-Box was fun for a child, right? Because the first reaction that a child gets to a Jack-in-the-Box is pretty frightening. So I'm going to suggest to you what we're about to see is a framework for thinking about what happens when a stress occurs. And if you're catching my drift, if that stress occurs and no one is there to buffer the child or help the child, the effects even of a modest stress can be pretty damaging. But watch what happens. So this is little Dane. He's 7 months old or so, and this is the second time he will be seeing a Jack-in-the-Box. So I'm going to play it for you and then unpack it together as a way of thinking about stress and what it does to the brain.
Okay, ready?
Now look at his face. He looks up at his mother. His eyes open. He's looking, his lip quivers. And he startles, right? And he's crying, and he's so upset. And his mother swoops in and helps him. So Dane is having a real hard time. He really was. So I want to unpack this with you. So at first we see Dane really looking, because he had seen this before. It's the second time now he's seen the Jack-in-the-Box. So he sees it and his eyes wide open. He looks at his mother, by the way, a response that will do him good throughout his life, unless the mother he's looking to, or the other, whoever that other is he's looking to, is not responsive, is not attuned, is not available or emotionally present. But he looks at his mother, looks back. Suddenly, what happens? The jack pops up. He cries. He goes into a fight or flight or freeze response, which we'll talk about. He looks back at his mother and says, "Help me," and she swoops right in to help him. Crisis averted, and she starts to comfort. So what did we just see? What happened in Dane's brain, and ours, by the way, when we are stressed? Well, certainly inside of Dane is this remarkable organ called the brain. The brain, by the way, at 5 months pregnancy, already has 100 billion nerve cells. That's the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy at 5 months of gestation. And those brain cells, the connecting among them, will define who we are individually, our uniqueness. And at birth, only about 20% of those 100 billion neurons, nerve cells, are connected based on intrauterine life, based on experiences through pregnancy, based on genetic code. But that means at birth, 80% of those connections need to be formed. And that's what we'll talk about in a moment. So certainly he has a brain. And what happens is when that brain undergoes stress, there's a little organ, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's a little organ right in the middle, somewhere over here in the middle of this picture, which I'll show you in another picture, called the amygdala. Oops, sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. Called the amygdala. And that amygdala activates when there's some kind of stress. When Dane saw that jack pop up, his amygdala immediately activated and sent a signal to the master gland called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus starts sending signals to other glands, notably the pituitary gland, and that sends a signal through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands, which pump out what? Adrenaline, right? So in a moment, Dane's brain had the amygdala open up, send a signal to the hypothalamus saying, "Hey, red alert, we're under attack here, help us out." And the brain gets into action, flooding our bloodstream with neurotransmitters and chemicals, notably norepinephrine and adrenaline. And it gets us ready to fight, flight, run, or freeze, those responses. And that happens all the time under stress in some way. So the brain response, known as the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, is what we talk about when we talk about a stress response, the HPA. And the amygdala is where it begins, that central part. So if you can think of our brain as not two brains, not one brain, but at least three, and then, of course, more broken into parts each one, we have the top layer of our brain that's called the cortex, the neocortex. By the way, cortex is Latin for bark. It's like the bark of a tree. Well, the top of our brain is the cortex. Now, probably many of you have seen pictures of the brain, but if you haven't, if you were to open up a walnut and keep the walnut intact, you'll see when you take off the shell, there's a left side and a right side, like a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And there's all these crevices. And so the walnut is like a brain-looking object. And the reason there's all those folds called convolutions is that if you were to flatten out the nerve cells in the brain so that they were all on one thin level, it would be the size of a double page of the New York Times. So in order to fit all of this brain matter into your head, crumple it up like you'd crumple a piece of paper, and that's what your brain does. But the top layer, which is the latest in evolution, is the thinking part. That's where we talk about planning, evaluation, expectation, anticipation, delay of gratification. all the kinds of good things happen in our thinking brain as we engage the world. But there are lower levels of our brain. One is a reptilian brain. That's the lower part of our brain, the spinal cord and the cerebellum, and that controls a lot of autonomic functions like breathing and heart rate and digestion and so on. And then that little red spot in the middle is called the limbic system, and that's where the amygdala is, and that's the emotional brain. Now, by the way, we sometimes talk about that when a child is overwhelmed or an adult is overwhelmed by stress, they are in the red brain. But when they're calm and alert and able to think and be rational, they're in the blue brain. And most of the times, by the way, we're in the purple brain, which means it's some blue and some red. And by the way, it's not a bad thing. Sometimes we need that kind of stress to really activate ourselves. But for now, just know that little Dane that we saw has a blue brain and a red brain, and we saw the red brain in action, which meant something happened to the blue brain where he was less available for engagement, for being calm, for learning, for communication. All of those things happen when our red brain gets activated. So this limbic system we'll talk about is right in the middle of your brain. And so the amygdala I mentioned is a real structure in babies, and it's based on real experiences. It gets hardwired from the earliest moments of life so that when a child is approached by a parent or an adult, and the child sees, in fact, the parent and smells the parent and touches the parent and nursing, maybe tastes the parent, understands their smell and their touch and their taste and what they look like, all of those areas of the brain light up. At the same time, the parent gives them a sense of love and warmth and comfort and pleasure, so that the child begins to form these brain connections among all these areas of the brain that represent his connection, his loop of things for safety and mother. On the other hand, if a child is exposed to stress, to chronic stress, or, as I said earlier, stress that does not get mitigated, stress that doesn't get buffered or felt with, stress that does not get co-regulated by others, the child will have less of an opportunity to really feel safety. And so that very same relationship, if it's hurtful or not so good, will be, in fact, regarded as not a safe, not a happy relationship. So the amygdala is this critical part of what happens in us. So I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, I know you're in your phones in front of your computers, so if you can look at my little picture, I'm going to say to you, ask you, lift up your hand, just like this, almost like you're making a salute, kind of a wave. And imagine, I'm sorry, some of my slides apparently are timed. So imagine if your thumb is that amygdala I talked about, and it's right next to this other organ that's called the hippocampus, which is like a memory place. So when the amygdala continues to see experiences that are frightening or dangerous, so if for Dane, the jack-in-the-box kept happening with no relief or support, at some point, he would begin to feel that his amygdala is remembering frightening things. So put your thumb in your hand and then cover your thumb with your fingers. So that's like the limbic system, the brown brain, the reptilian brain, your spinal cord and your wrist are the cerebellum. That's the autonomic function. Your thumb is that red brain and the fingers are the blue brain. But what happens when that red brain activates? You flip your lid, right? So think about, this is a great metaphor, by the way, to work with children. And I'm married 36 and a half years. It's a great metaphor for marriage, because how many times have you flipped your lid, right? How many times have you, lost it? Something happened and your red brain took over and your blue brain got derailed. Well, that's what happens to children. Now, by the way, when that happens, depending on your life as a parent, it could activate some trauma in you. It could make you feel in a way, the way you felt if you had sometimes in your own life felt not understood, not responded to. So Parenting is humbling, as I said, because it requires us to always be the adult, to be bigger and safer, and to be protective and co-regulating, even when we're exhausted as heck, and even when the child is just not joining us there. And so the child needs for us to always be bigger and kinder and more regulating. And that's the tough part, because this is the brain system we all have. And besides Dan Siegel, who's a neuroscientist and psychiatrist and author, other people have written about this. But Dan Siegel says, if you lift up your fingers and you'll have an image of how we flip our lids and head down the low road in our interaction with others. And sometimes when children are under stress, they will behave in ways that don't seem rational. And so this was my attempt at humor, because what happens in the amygdala does not stay in the amygdala. It goes through the entire brain and it starts activating other responses. And so you'll see later what this means is that sometimes when a child is under stress, they will misbehave. And one framing that we will ask you to think about, and I'll talk about this later, is that when you see misbehavior, reframe it as stress behavior. Because when children are under stress, and when you are under stress, that really is going to sometimes result in the kind of loss of control in the way you'd like to, the loss of ability to stay calm. And this is just another example of what happens, as I said, when stress occurs. So again, I talked to you about how remarkable the brain is. If you think about this, as I said, 100 billion neurons by 5 months gestation, 20% are connected, 80% are not, and they'll be formed by relationships over the course of the first several years of life. Each of those 100 billion neurons can form up to 10,000 connections with other neurons near and far. And these connections can occur at the rate of 700 a second in the first year, meaning over 1 million a minute in each year and each day in the first years of life. So I often say to folks, the brain is not a noun, it is a verb. It is a pulsing, active organ that is constantly mediating and reflecting what is happening in the world. So an infant and young child, remember secondary altriciality, they are required to have adults around them who continually support and help them. Now, I want to go back to the humbling stuff, right? You don't have to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. There are going to be times you don't get there fast enough, or you don't protect your child, something just doesn't happen, or you're not really available emotionally to give the kind of comfort you need. But if you're there enough, the child actually learns that sometimes they have to figure out a way to help themselves, but most of the times you're going to be the one to help them. So it's important for you to recognize that. And by the way, when I first entered this field over 35 years ago, my daughter was just born. I wanted to go back in her life, even though she was only less than a year old or about a year old. I wanted to go back and apologize to all the mistakes I was making. If right now you're saying to yourself, oh my gosh, I made all these mistakes, really join the club. It is partly what we all feel as parents. The good news is science is telling us that that's okay, that we can make mistakes. We try not to make them in dramatic and toxic ways, but we have to be at least good enough over the course of our lives with children. So the human brain early on forms connections, especially in the first 2 to 3 years of life, and that really sets the foundation for higher level circuits. The brain grows from the bottom to the top, and it's a social organism developed through interactions and relationships. And one of the things I love is we talked about this limbic system. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I suspect you have. But many times when you are with someone who is happy and you spend time with them, you kind of feel happy. Sometimes when you're with someone who is sad, you spend time with them and you leave their space and you say to yourself, oh my God, I'm dragging myself. I feel, because we vibrate with each other. This is particularly true for young children. They vibrate with the mood and the feelings. And so that middle brain, that limbic brain, Alan Shore, this remarkable UCLA neuropsychologist, says that the mother's limbic system communicates directly to the baby's limbic system. And so when the baby is upset, but the mother can stay calm and attuned to the baby's limbic system begins to calm themselves. There's a remarkable thing that happens when we can recognize that our task at those times is not necessarily discipline or coercion or control, but to really help them find a way to calm as a vehicle for them to feel able again to recover and to grow. So this was nicely described by this wonderful British infant specialist called Colin Trevarthen, where he kind of made this image that says what happens between mother and baby, eye contact, language, gestures, movement, pacing, is a remarkable thing. He called it the musicality of the infant-parent relationship. So 2 months later, after a lot of experiences that Dane had with his mother comforting him, take a look at what happens with Dane. Now, I'm going to not do this one live. I knew we didn't have that much time, so I'm trying to make it sparse. But what Dane here is showing us. So Dane's mother shows him I'm just checking my time, shows him the Jack-in-the-Box again. So here's Dane looking for the Jack-box. His mother is turning the crank, and he's looking down at it. You can see he tightens up a little bit. He lifts up his shoulders like, here it comes. But I'm not turning away. I got this one. I know what's happening. It pops up. He looks right at it. Take a look at what happens here. Right? He takes a look. He looks at his mother again, which he always will do when there's something that either is uncertain or something he really wants her or him, whoever the parent is, to know. Then watch what he does. He grabs a little block and he comforts himself a little bit. There's a little stress he felt, but it's tolerable stress. He mouthed the block just to help comfort himself. Then he still kind of grimaces at the fact that it came and went. It's coming up again. He looks at it, looks right on. He's looking at the foe, unthwarted, not timidly. Looks at his mom, I missed the final one. He actually raises his hand in a salute that shows he's really ready to take it on. And again, this is what happens around. There he is. So he puts his arm up, he smiles, and he salutes us all with this victory. Dane has grown. Dane has grown. What was stressful, he made it through because of the coordinated, attuned care of his caregiver. So remember, stress can make children behave in certainly bad ways or misbehaving ways. Certainly for Dane, his crying was a response to fear, but he made it through now, and what used to be this object of fear is now really maybe rightfully called play, because now Dane can play with fear. He can say, I can pretend something is going to scare me, and then it doesn't, and I'm stronger. So that's partly what play does. So remember, Dane has a brain inside of his head, but this time, instead of all those red spikes, his brain is now wired in a good way. That means the cortex, the neocortex, is ready for thought and engagement with people. There's no rush of adrenaline. He has all these mood centers that are being wired, and his hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system is not activated, right? So again, he's pleased, and sort of his mother swoops in and kisses him, and the world is okay. So what are the lessons, right? The brain is really organized through relationships. And by the way, long before there is language, the child and the brain is set to respond to affect, facial gestures, rhythm, tone of voice. I'll talk about that in a second. Critical. And all of those systems are online. And that when there is chronic and toxic stress, that can change the brain by hardwiring it to be in a high alert all the time. So the need for safety. I just want to share with you this theory that was developed by a neuroscientist and occupational therapist named Stephen Porges. And it's become for me one of the most useful theories in our field because as a theory, it accounts for a lot of the observations that we have in this field. So what he says is the first thing that we humans, and think of Dane, think of your child, when your child walks into a new place or meets a new person or has some kind of encounter with strangeness or novelty. The first thing that you will do when you walk into a room, you're going into a room to have an interview for a job, you're meeting the principal if you're a teacher for the first time, what do? You look for safety. You are looking for features of safety. Is the other person smiling? Do they seem friendly? Do they seem warm? Is there anything about the tone of their voice or their affect that worries me? And that Stephen Porges says this starts from birth, when babies are trying to calm their defense systems by looking for features of safety. And it starts at birth when they need to be soothed entirely by the caregiver. Secondary altriciality, remember that. So our need to feel safe is so profound that we seek this before we even realize it. So we need to feel safe. We look for features of safety and such as caring face-to-face interactions and warm voices. But when our safety brain gets activated, that means our limbic, the red brain, gets activated and it frightens us. It deactivates our thinking brain, and that limits learning and growth and restoration. So you get the idea, right? Stress in a chronic state makes a child look like they are learning disabled, makes them look like they are misbehaving. And around stress, cumulative stress can happen. So the baseline of stress that we all have been facing, by the way, these past several months, has been higher, so that things that maybe you and your child could have handled before, fights with the siblings, maybe things that are happening on an everyday level that on most days wouldn't get to a high level of concern, they might feel more like a concern now. What helps is having adults who can help the child stay regulated, and that happens through connectedness. And again, remember, this is true for babies, but it's also true throughout life. Now, I love this chart, this little graphic, and I'm hoping that in this little moment I can explain what it represents. Our ability to calm ourselves under stress when we are very young, so all the way on the left side, early in development, our ability to self-calm ourselves is very small. You see that little circle in the middle, right? Is our ability to calm ourselves is very small. We rely other people in our lives to calm us. But with development, we become more and more able to calm ourselves because other people have been calming us, and we are internalizing and introjecting, take in their ability to help us feel calm. But what's interesting is even at the end of this cone of regulation, you'll notice that even though the ability to self-regulate, self-calm has grown tremendously, there's still space between our ability to calm ourselves and other people, which means there are times, even when stress as an adult can become unmanageable, and we still need others to help us regulate. So in a sense, the goal of development is never full independence, it's interdependence. It's our recognition that throughout our lives, we will rely on other relationships and other people. And so again, but your task is to be that other in your child's life early in development and throughout their development that continues to try to help them develop a way to be calm and become calm when disturbances and stress occurs. And this happens again throughout life. And so what's interesting is Stephen Porges said in all cultures, certain prosody and acoustical, certain intonation and sounds really help children. And by the way, sometimes it's drumming, sometimes it's singing. In other cultures, it's always an effective strategy for helping calm babies. And this is true for adults as well. And so I want to lead you into, as we're kind of going to the meat of what I hope we can touch on, that in order for us to recognize how we can best help infants, young children, older children, and other adults, the first thing that children look at and depend on is your facial expressions, the tone of your voice, your movement and pacing and gestures. And these are all more powerful than words. So always in speaking to a child, monitor the intonation of your voice, get in at their level and speak to them. Convey everything in your body, if you can, that you want to convey calmness and interest and willing to listen to them and follow their lead. And by the way, you can get the point, right? This is so hard to do when we're heightened in our own level of arousal and excitation. Excitation. So the key is to be sure we take care of ourselves. So on the top part, Stephen Porges wrote this in the kind of scientific way. He talked about something called neuroception, meaning we take it without even being aware of it, that we listen, and if we have the appropriate kind of intonation and warm face, we feel safe. But in English, that means a child automatically feels safe when the adult has a warm, expressive face and voice and more easily makes social connections and learns when the child feels safe. So you might be able to tell by my name and my manner, I'm Italian. And I have to say, in my Italian culture, intonation is a strange thing to understand because sometimes people are speaking loudly and harshly, but they're not mad at each other. It's part of the passion, I guess. So I love this cartoon, and I cut it out for use in the presentations I do. And that says half of my problems because of the tone of my voice. Everyone thinks I'm arguing. Well, I'm just really talking. So there are individual differences. We know that. It's not everyone has to be the same. So let's talk about what happens if stress doesn't get felt with and modulated and calm. And that's the good, the bad, the ugly. The good news is, first of all, that Dane succeeded. After Dane had that frightening experience, over the course of repeated exposure and support from his mother, he actually became more resilient and robust. Believe it or not, there is a prevailing amount of evidence that suggests children grow as a result of moderate or mild or tolerable stress, that children learn how to be resilient. So the good part of stress is, number one, it's always there. There'll always be things you can't control. There'll always be things that will happen that you have no way of expecting, and sometimes not even a way of understanding. But the good is that when that happens to your child, you can provide a safe, supportive, buffering way of helping the child feel safe. This is a longer conversation I would love to have at another point, but the idea that you as an adult may not always feel like you can promise your child that all will be safe is a worry that we adults have to share. It's not a worry children should have. Certainty must be the province of childhood. Uncertainty is the province of adulthood. Children must know you will take care of them. They will be safe with you. They will be good. That's the good side of stress. It helps us grow. The bad side of stress is what we saw happened when Dane saw this frightening event. He is thrown into a fight, flight, or freeze response, and it creates a nervous system response that in the short term is helpful because it activates us to fight or freeze or flee, mostly fight or flight. And then to freeze is the worst part, where someone almost plays dead, where they're just not able to leave the situation. So the fight or flight response is good in the short run, but it's kind of bad in the long run if it's always happening. If your fight or flight response is always activated, it bathes your brain and nervous system in stress hormones that actually can be sort of corrosive and erosive, that it can actually, in a sense, make some of you and make some of our children wired to be heightened in their level of alertness. So the bad is when there's no buffering that happens, right? And the real ugly, by the way, when there's never a chance to recovery, when there's never someone where the stress keeps coming, but there's no availability of others to buffer the child. And so the stress certainly in and of itself is manageable when there's others in the child's life. So Paul Tuff in 2012 wrote a book called How Children Succeed, a journalist from New Jersey, by the way, at the time, and his kids were in New Jersey schools. And he was interested in looking in school research and trying to find out what seems to really help kids do well in school and grow. And he talked about something called the firehouse effect. He said, when kids are chronically activated and stressful, that HPA system I mentioned, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, the frontal cortex, the blue brain, the top, the lid, is the most affected. And what suffers? Executive functioning, thinking, remembering, planning, evaluating, organizing, delaying gratification, all of those executive functions. And what happens is the air traffic control of our system, in some sense, the cortex, which helps us organize our thoughts, is derailed. Jack Shonkoff is this remarkable pediatrician and neurologist who heads the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and he's studied this extensively. So the firehouse effect. And so we either have a kid who's chronically, who maybe has chronic stress, where his lid is always flipped, and that's the lower line, right, where the child is closed and reactive. The lid is flipped and he's not able to think and use his thinking well, or the open receptive state. And of course, the one that we want to cultivate is the one that we will feed the most. And feeding the most has to do with us as adults doing our best to be as available as possible to sort of understand and try to help children feel attuned and co-regulated. And so certainly loving relationships do that. And so instead of those red lines being activated, we have neurons that are being wired together to form networks of care and support. So I developed a little acronym to help us think about this. That when a child is behaving in a way that, as I said, try to reframe from misbehavior to stress behavior, when a child is behaving in a way that I am going to suggest you can look at often as a stress response, first, try to look at what's happening, assess the situation, think about maybe something that might be going on. Is the child biologically, is there some kind of illness working on the child? Is he not feeling well? Did he have poor sleep? Is he irritated in some physical way? Is he allergic to something? And certainly, what are the other influences? Is there something that's bothered him and is frightening him or made him angry? Then try to figure out, hypothesize, what can help? What would help him become more regulated? Whether it's the changes you make as the adult in monitoring your voice, of giving him some options. I know you're angry. Look at me. I know you're angry. Tell me you're angry. Tell me. What would help you? Should we go find a book? Would that help you? Try to hypothesize what might work and then only act. And so when you act, I've come up with an acronym called AGILE. Pay attention when you act. And by the way, not just to your children, but to everyone if you can, is pay attention to your affect, your facial expressions and voice and certainly your movements, your gestures, your movements and pacing, because children look at that. The intonation of your voice, there is some research that suggests almost half of the meaning a child derives from a social exchange is based on tone of voice. By the way, you know this, I think. If, you have a situation where you ask someone a question and they give you the right verbal answer, but it doesn't match their intonation of voice, intonation usually wins. So if you said to your partner, listen, you look mad. Did I do something to make you mad, or is something bothering you? And they go like this, no. Well, if you listen to the no, the word, you might be misguided by what happened, right? You're going to respond. Intonation will always beat out the language, the verbal, all the time. And a child, your tone of voice is so important. Latency, give the child a chance to take you in. One of the things we tend to do when we are active ourselves is talk too much. If you remember the Charlie Brown cartoons where the adults are always sounding like wah, 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 and all that stuff, we have to really try to be a little quieter and wait, and then we engage the child. So Agile is a little memory for that. I'm going to skip some of these because I wanted to get maybe another 5 or 10 minutes of talking, so I can really just have a chance to answer some questions or maybe have a little dialogue with you. So we want to talk about this notion of stress, and I talked to you about this model early on called self-reg. And the reason we're focusing on self-reg is that one of the things we're learning in our field of neurology and infant and early childhood mental health is that one of the variables that really seems to be ever present and in a sense is part of our human condition is that there are hidden effects of stress that we often ignore. We don't recognize them as stress. And the best learning we can have is when we are calm and alert, and that's when we learn and engage. And if you remember, that's the lid intact. That's where the blue brain, the cortex, is really able to take things in, right? So stress and the system that regulates our stress response can play a real big role in how we are, in a sense, functioning overall as humans, or well-being, how the children are functioning. And by the way, you may know this, but when you are under high stress, what happens is your nervous system tends to slow down your digestion. It also pumps a lot of blood into your circulatory system and your musculature to prepare you to fight or flee. As you may know, and you've heard, under stress, sometimes we become extraordinarily energetic, but it quickly depletes us. We have a post-stress exhaustion, right? So in the short run, it helps to activate something to keep us safe. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this said, that if a lion walks into the room, if we were all gathered together, I have to be faster than the slowest person to survive, right? I have to be fast enough to get out of there. And that's because the nervous system pumps us up, slows our digestion down. Why should we digest food if we're about to become food? All right, so slows our digestion and makes our body, in a sense, overactive for fight or flight. But if the stressor is an emotional stressor, it's not that there's a real lion endangering us, but if it feels like an emotional stressor that makes us feel psychologically not safe and happy, we have evolved in such a way that our stress system reacts to real dangers in the same way it reacts to perceived dangers. Often people will try to tell a child, oh, there's no reason to be afraid. There's no monsters under your bed. You'll be fine. Well, there's no reason to worry. That alarm outside is okay. That it'll go off soon. Those are rational arguments, which I think we have to always use. But we have to recognize that there are some ways in which the stress felt is not so rational. But still, what helps is the caring buffering of another who remains calm, who offers the child a way to figure out what might help them, offers the child a way to express it. So when we talk about self-regulation, it is the ability to achieve, maintain, and even change your level of energy to match what's needed to do. You keep looking at yourself and monitoring yourself. You shift attention when necessary. That means self-regulation means you have the ability to stop what you're doing now and shift it over to some other area of attention. You have to really engage in a variety of different interactions and connect with and care about what others are feeling, to have empathy, and we'll talk about that. So self-regulation, it turns out, many have argued in our field, and I'm one of them who have argued this, that it is almost more important in school that children be self-regulated. Self-regulation is really more important than IQ, because self-regulation is what allows us to grow and learn and be calm and alert. Truth be told, that there are many children who come to school with heightened levels of stress, and the self-reg framework is really a way of acknowledging that and trying to identify ways to feel closer and calmer. So what we know about self-regulation is that it really gets acquired first by being with others, co-regulation. So I'm going to ask your forgiveness. I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I do see I'm running a little bit over. So I want to be sure we have time. So I'm going to just skip a couple of slides. I was going to show you this remarkable little video clip, but I think we'll have to do without it. And so the self-regulation framework, I just want to wrap that up, is they talk about 5 areas to think about in your child and in yourself. Could a child have stress that comes from some emotion, a biological problem? There are children who often have sensitivities, sensory sensitivities. I work a lot with children on the autism spectrum, and many children identified on the autism spectrum have visual and tactile sensitivities, auditory sensitivities. So we all have biologically based differences, and sometimes they're transient, like you are fatigued or feel hungry or irritable, or you have a cold or a fever, and those will make you feel more stress. But sometimes it's part of your basic equipment. We have emotional things that lead us to feel stress. We have cognitive stressors. Those are sometimes task demands. Many children, for example, might have a hard time with writing or mathematics, and they may see those as challenging skills cognitively. Sometimes children feel a social stress, a sense of not being comfortable with certain people or not getting along and having conflicts. And then there's something called prosocial, which is almost like a spiritual stress, a stress that we feel when sometimes we are worried about people or worried about things. And so, I'm going to skip these. I was going to go over a little of them, but that last one, the prosocial, is really one that I think creates great stress in us. Look, you may know people who seem to behave as if they don't care about other people. They just go out about their lives and their world, imagining that, whatever they do and it has consequences, they don't care. That's unusual. Empathy, when you have empathy for someone, when your child has empathy for you, when your child misbehaves and they know that it's bothering you, even when they can't control themselves, that's a stressor because they're trying so hard to figure out how not to do it, but they can't always do it on themselves. So you can tell that we talked about reframing stress, reframing misbehavior as stress behavior. And then trying to identify among those 5 domains what might be going on and try to figure out a way, if you can, to reduce that stressor, reflect on what's going on and respond. I know this is an area I really wish I could have spent more time on. So shift your lens when stress happens from misbehavior to stress behavior. And I'm going to just figure out, okay, so fight, flight, freeze, and social engagement. So I want to close up with a couple of reminders. So your facial expressions, your voice, those are all critically important on how you connect with your child when they're stressed. And maintaining your own calmness and willingness to be with them is really what helps them. As I said, we first engage through affects and gestures and intonation. And even throughout life, before you overtalk and use lots of words, show that your affect and gestures are paying attention to the child. And this is how we grow with each other. And this is that agile. I'm going to share this PowerPoint. I should have said this earlier with Ms. Samuel. So you'll have this. But this, always remember affect, gestures, intonation, weight, latency, take your time and then engage. And Dan Siegel, who's this remarkable neuropsychologist who wrote this wonderful book called The Whole Brain Child, I'd recommend it for all of you. He says when a child is under stress, first connect to the right side of their brain, which is the spatial brain, the brain that reads affect and gestures. Don't talk a lot. Just show your facial expressions and voice. And then when you're calmer, go to the left side and you can use words and so on. So I am going to show this one slide, and I know we're verging on the end, but I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, there were the Paris attacks, terrorist attacks, and this is a little video of a child so stressed by what happened, and his father talking to him about the stress that's happened. And this, by the way, is an incredibly sensitive reporter. So I just wanted to show you this. So take a look and then we'll talk.
Tu comprends ce qui s'est passé? Tu comprends pourquoi ces gens ils ont fait ça?
Oui, parce qu'ils sont très 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 méchants. Les méchants, c'est pas très gentil, les méchants. Et il faut faire vraiment attention parce il faut changer de maison.
T'inquiète pas. On a besoin de changer de maison. C'est la France, la maison.
Mais il y a les méchants, papa.
Oui, mais il y a des méchants partout. Des méchants partout.
Ils ont les pistolets, ils peuvent nous tirer dessus parce qu'ils sont très très méchants, papa.
Ah oui, ils ont des pistolets, nous on a des fleurs.
Bah, les fleurs, ça fait rien, c'est pour,
Si, regarde, tout le monde pose des fleurs.
Watch the child's
Oui.
facial
Pour
expression.
c'est pour protéger. Et les bougies aussi.
C'est pour ne pas oublier les gens qui sont partis. Hein.
C'est pour nous protéger les fleurs et les bougies.
Ça va mieux du coup?
Oui, ça va mieux.
Tu comprends?
I thought this was one of the most remarkable little videos. I'm just going to stop here. And I hope you can hear it, but that the father in his own way was creating a safety zone for his child that says, you're safe here, we'll be okay. And again, a young child can't handle the stressors of the world. So remember, kids are always watching us. They're wondering how we're going to help them through this tough time. And I hope today's presentation at least gave you some ideas on how to help your children when stress does come. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I'm going to stop, and I know we have very little time to talk with each other, and I am so sorry. But I would love if there is time. Hello, Laura Prado. I just see you. But I hope if there are questions, Ms. Samuels, or comments, I would love if you can read some of them. But I wish 15 minutes more. I would have liked it, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Costa. That was so much great information that we can use with children. One question that we have is, to what extent do you feel and think that the shutdown since March, remote learning, and the resulting limited social interaction have lasting effects on young children, and how can parents best help?
Yeah. What a great question. And I'm sure this is on all of our minds. So I hope this doesn't sound too easy, because it's not. I think it's changed our lives tremendously. I think we were having a chat before the formal presentation began. COVID's been a teacher to us. It's taught us that things that we would rely on in the past aren't always going to be there, and that there are other ways to connect with each other that, for good or for bad, are available in ways that we didn't have earlier. And so I think that there's no question children are affected by having lost their routines, by not having been with their playmates, missing their teachers, being in the house, feeling a sense of isolation. But given that was a stressor that families could not control, how the families responded to that, how they tried to provide some meaning for the children and offer them opportunities to express and experience what they were feeling, to increase their connections using platforms like Zoom and others, to do safe being with others with distance and masks. I think to the extent that all of us were affected, it was a stressor. It changed us. It certainly changed our neurology and our psychology. I do think that for the most part, with families and systems that can help children buffer, I think if that happens, children will be fine. There will not be any lasting effects, in my judgment, if we can help them feel that they are still safe, that we are still caring for them and wanting to connect them. And by the way, I feel I have to say that's probably such an inexact answer. I wish there could be more of a global answer. I can say that either everything is going to be fine, or it's going to be terrible. They're going to have lasting effects. I don't believe the second, and I don't yet feel confident to say everyone will be fine, but I think so much will depend on how the adults in their lives help them organize it. I mean, let me just say one other thing. some of what I say comes from a long amount of research in zones where children are in war. So in the Middle East and in Ireland for years, research has been done on how do children tolerate living in war zones where there are constant missiles flying overhead, where there are frequent sounds of attacks and shootings. And what James Garbarino, Dr. James Garbarino, this remarkable researcher, has written a number of 17 books on youth violence. And he talks about how in those circumstances, children remarkably do well when their parents can buffer them, can still help them feel safe. So I think, the old line, we have to get in cahoots with ourselves. We have to try to be sure that we don't visit our own worries on young children. They can be okay if you can help them through it.
Thank you. Another question is, when we are eventually back to school in the school building, do you think there are things that parents need to look for in a specific way? There are tangible things like wearing masks, washing hands, and giving space, but how do we emotionally look out for kids when they're back in new routines?
Gosh, I love that. I think that one of the things we've been talking about in our new project that we have, that NJIETA project you mentioned, we are trying to think of all sorts of ways that we can provide guidance to teachers and parents about ways to help children anticipate what they will be facing when they go to school. And so practice wearing masks at home, certainly asking them to represent in whatever way they can through drawings and storytellings and playing with doll figures and houses, asking the children, depending on how young they are, to sort of share their day and what happened with them. I think the things you want to look out for are children who, in fact, are coming home and appear more anxious or worried. There may be a normal kind of return to some clingy behavior, but I think for the most part, if parents can provide children with some anticipatory practice about what they will be facing when they go into school, and giving them an opportunity to tell their story when they come home, to really share what happened. I also think this is especially where the open exchange between the teacher and parent is critical. So parents can check with teachers to see, how their child is doing and what's going on. But this feels like such an issue that's so worth a conversation. I wish we could have had more time for that one.
It looks like the chat is pretty quiet, but some of the feedback that I'm reading is this is the most helpful presentation that some parents have experienced. It gives them quite helpful information. It engages philosophy that is aligned with the preschool curriculum, and they find it very helpful.
Well, that's great to
thank you for
hear.
that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And again, gosh, I wish we were in the same room and we can talk back and forth. Wouldn't it be nice? What are suggestions on disciplining lovingly but sternly? Such a fine balance. It's so fascinating because certainly limit setting and setting guidelines is really critical. Children, there's a wonderful term that was developed there's a program called Safe Havens. That term has been used for many programs, but Safe Havens was actually a training program for teachers that was developed by Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the Family Communications Incorporated in Pittsburgh. And it was designed so that teachers could really better help children who were exposed to trauma and violence and undue stress. And they had a term called corral of safety, meaning that within this space that you have, you're pretty okay to play the way you want to play and do the things you want to do. But there's a certain limit that you have to feel. When children don't feel a real sense of limit, they are frightened by their power. They are afraid, I'll carry up. I may do something that will hurt myself and hurt others and worry my mother or make my mother angry. So they need that. I think the loving part is, it's sort of what I think comes from the tone of your voice and the actions of your heart. I mean, I genuinely mean it, that kids can tell when you're trying your hardest to help them be calmer. I think if there's one shift that we talk about here, is don't focus on the behavior and try to get behavioral compliance. Sit down, sit straight, don't touch that, do this. That's important at some point, but more important is the inner calm, teaching them how to breathe sometimes. You know, there's a 4-7-8. Did you ever hear the 4-7-8 breathing? You breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds, hold it for 7 seconds, and then breathe out of your mouth for 8 seconds. And do that for 5 times with a gap in between. Help your children learn how to really help themselves calm. There's a fantastic curriculum developed by Goldie Hawn's Foundation called Mind Up. And it's published by Scholastic Books. And they actually talk to children about how to check into their amygdala every day. Listen, I'm married 36 years. I want to check my amygdala every day, because it's always popping. It's always popping for some reason. So I think if I could say to the parents during this very stressful time, it may be that children are in a pressure cooker, their home or their density of population, there's less variability, there's less mobility and all of that stuff. Helping children by having activities, by having a schedule. I early on talked about quarantine being routine, creating new routines, giving children choices. I'd love to have more conversation by this. So maybe I'll be happy to come back for a part 2 on whatever topic you want.
Dr. Costa, we have been so wonderfully grateful to have you this evening. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Not at all.
The group and I are grateful to have you. We would love to have you back. I would love to talk with you about that. Karen Weiland and the Parenting Center, thank you for arranging this.
Karen, thanks so much. And I'll send you, Karen, I'll send you the PowerPoint.
Thanks so much. That was amazing. Thank you.
Let me stop my microphone. I appreciate it, and I look forward to getting together. And I'm sorry to point out my old friend Laura Prado, but I don't see her much, so I'm so happy to see her. I know. I'm sorry, Laura, for doing that to you. But thank you so much, Karen, Miss Weiland, and Miss Samuels. And Keith, I don't remember your last name. Thank you. Keith Bonds. Mr. Bonds, thanks for helping us with this.
Thank you, everyone. Safety and health to all. Have a good night.
Good night.